Thank you, folks. Welcome to this, the fourth session of the Fast Forward lecture series. Congratulations on finding your way to this somehow completely obvious, but also somehow very hard to find venue. Great to have you here. A little bit of housekeeping to start with. If in the unlikely event of an emergency, we'll gather out on Grafton Road. Bathrooms, if you go down that way, they're to the left. If you go up that way, they're to the right. Next order of business is to offer our really grateful thanks to Jib. 17 years they've been sponsoring this Fast Forward series, so I'm going to show you a Jib video. So one of the things that's interesting, one of the things that's most interesting about the School of Architecture and Planning is that we are a school of architecture and planning. And so we pay attention to, we attend to, we teach, we generate young professionals across quite a broad swathe of disciplines: architecture, heritage, urban planning, urban design. So it's been amazing to watch the evolution of Isthmus, which started out in a kind of much narrower band of those disciplines that's been around since 1988. So a firm that's been around for a long time, but particularly in the last, I want to say, decade or so, has really expanded its offering into a whole bunch of different fields. Starting out in planning and master planning, urban design, and now attending to architecture, landscape architecture, even graphic design. You guys have got a graphic design arm. So fantastic kind of range of disciplines that maps actually really closely onto what we do at the school. And so for me, who's from the architecture side, it's been amazing to see all of this kind of super interesting work emerge from Isthmus. And Aucklanders, of course, will be familiar with some of those quite high-profile projects. The Te Wānanga down on the waterfront next to the ferry building, which offers this kind of amazing new kind of facility for the central city, and then, of course, the boardwalk up on the top of Mangawhao, Mount Eden, as a kind of amazing, now kind of iconic moment in Auckland placemaking. So I'm super interested to hear some more about this. So would you join me in welcoming Helen Kerr and Andre de Graaf. Thank you very much.
Tēnā tātou katoa, ko kohu nui te maunga, ko waro te awa, no tamaki makaurau ahau, ko Helen Kerr tōku ingoa. Kia ora koutou, I'm Helen Kerr, and I'm a principal landscape architect and also our urban design discipline lead across our three studios in Tamaki, Te Whanganui, Atara and Otatahi. Urban design lead role was previously held by Andre, who's now straddling architecture as the architecture discipline lead. And so between us, we sort of hold a story about that evolution of architecture and urban design inside Isthmus and how it's grown over that period of time that Andrew mentioned. So, and why it's important to us as a practice to have those disciplines working together.
Tēnā koutou katoa, Andre and Graaf, of course. Yes, I'm an architect and urban designer. I'm a principal at Isthmus. I've also worn a few hats over the years. As Helen said, I've straddled architecture and urban design and back currently leading the architecture discipline. And just work a lot across all scales, at various scales and across all disciplines. I think it's fair to say I'm often accused of not sticking to my lane because we're kind of interested and curious about lots of different things around the built environment. I'll leave it at that.
Cool. So we are Isthmus. Our kaupapa is to regenerate Aotearoa by connecting land, people, culture. We work in Aotearoa and nowhere else, up and down the motu, and that gives us a chance to look through a unique lens at the way we do things here that is different to elsewhere in the world, through a te ao Māori lens and also through a local and regional lens. It's an important question to ask, where our origins came from and why we've evolved the way we have. I think we have a sort of a uniquely different version of how our disciplines inside the practice sort of interrelate. And this drawing is kind of illustrating a table where landscape is the table, it's the foundation, it's the whenua for everything we do. We've grown from landscape roots as landscape architects. And on top of that, urban design is kind of the arrangement of the built elements on top of that table, and architecture is the design of the built elements themselves. And together, all of these things we interpret through a cultural lens, whether that's through the Māori worldview or whether it's through Pakeha worldview or other, but also the interrelationships between those things that need to be contextualised to be understood.
Yeah, I mean, we just, I think when we thought about this talk, we were sort of grappling with quite a few projects that we often are talking about creating demand or meeting demand, and I think the role as designers for all of us is that we can actually be advocates for change, and that change is not happening fast enough. And so the idea of actually creating demand rather than simply meeting demand is something that we hold quite dear, and really want to sort of own the space of getting mind shifts and starting to think about things differently. So hence the topic we want to talk about a little bit more today is not just meeting demand, but actually creating demand.
So just a little more context around where we base ourselves in our studios and how we work. I'm from Tamaki. I grew up here and I've worked in Tamaki for sort of 20 years of my career. I now reside in Ōtautahi in Christchurch. And I moved there 5 years ago in the middle of COVID. It was a really brave move for Isthmus to open a studio in a really tough time, and to make a go of that. But I'm really glad that we did. There were 3 of us. We started off in what we called the sardine tin, and we ended up here in a place called the Yard, which is on the South Frame in Christchurch. And I think it kind of epitomises what it's like to be in the sort of, more than a decade on from the earthquakes. It's a city that has sort of got a lot of energy building around it. And there's a school right next door to our studio, so there's kind of life happening in this greenway that is kind of exciting. If you flip around the view, some Williams Corp type terrace houses popping up around us, but actually they're mostly sort of Airbnb, so that it's kind of pushing out residents out of the city because the desire and the need is for that temporary accommodation, and it's a way to sort of make money from those things. So it's a sort of an interesting mix. It's a really easy place to cycle, Christchurch. It's family friendly, and there's a lot of people moving there. So my commute to work is largely pleasant, but sometimes looks like that and is just absolute chaos. So it's a city still in sort of build back mode, but also leading the way in a lot of things as well, how to build back better. And in the 5 years that I have been there, I've witnessed quite a lot of change. There has been sort of an increase in traffic, unfortunately, and the city keeps growing, and the inward migration that's sort of happening from other cities and other parts of the country is sort of contributing to that. So while there's a lot more people cycling, there's also just a lot more people in general. And these images are from the Greater Christchurch Spatial Plan, and they kind of illustrate the growth. A lot of growth is happening in those satellite towns in Rolleston and Rangiora, where the disruption of the earthquake sent people out to what had been called the City of the Future years ago on safe ground, Rolleston, and it turned out to be the insurance policy for people to kind of move when the earthquakes hit. And that's kind of set in motion a lot of sprawl and affordable housing and a reason for people to move there, but with no mass rapid transport or links to kind of connect back into the city. So there's some interesting things going on in Christchurch, let alone this image here, which shows that it's coupled with the challenges of sort of subsidence, liquefaction and inundation and building back in a hazard-prone landscape.
And I'm based in the Tamaki studio. It's the biggest one of the 3 studios. We're at about 50 to 55 people in Tamaki. But I actually originally hail from the Netherlands, but grew up in South Africa. And I arrived in New Zealand in 1997 in Aotearoa. And I always sort of think back to the things that have formed my thinking and my experiences of kind of the smallness and the waterways of the Netherlands, and then equally the sort of experiences I had in Africa of big, open, more sparse landscapes. And I often reflect that Tamaki has really been home ever since, where water and land is often at the interplay of that. So it's very much home. We used to be on the periphery of the city, and just as COVID was hitting and everyone was always going to work from home forever after and the cities were going to die, we, in typical Isthmus fashion, wanted to sort of swim against the tide and back the city. It was almost a move of sort of protest and a taking a stand for voting for the city, and we chose to go right back into the heart of the city, and we're now at 246 Queen Street. And just very quickly, the name Isthmus, you probably will probably realise, is actually, it started in Tamaki. We are on an isthmus, but metaphorically the name for us is always about connecting things that are bigger than us and making connections, whether they're physical or more visceral. So, yeah.
Cool. Hobsonville's a project that I remember sort of marking the event of Isthmus integrating architecture within Isthmus just over sort of more than 10 years ago. And Isthmus were the master planners for this at the time, creating sort of bold strokes and spatial moves to shape a community on the former Hobsonville Air Base. This story's been told a few times, so I'm sure a lot of you know it, but it was to become a completely brand new suburb, over 3,500 homes. That number's gone up, and it was on government-owned land. So it sort of set, at the time there was very little precedent for its scale and type in Tamaki, or the country even, and the way that we went about studying what might need to go there and how that might create a step change was interesting. It was the start of a journey for us, but we used the analogy of the Jackson Pollock painting, which was sort of about, big controlled strokes to create the appearance of randomness in a sort of an organic nature, to sort of combat the homogeneity and sort of monotonous nature of the kinds of housing that we were seeing appear. So it was a way of ensuring there was variety and diversity inside everything that was created over a period of time. And it's now one of Auckland's most desirable neighbourhoods, and the exception to the country generally getting a really low score on social cohesion and well-being, but actually Hobsonville seems to have achieved the reverse in that it's a really cohesive community.
One of the things about Hobsonville when we first started out was there was one of the key constraints we had to work with the master plan was that the plan change stipulated a 40 dwellings a hectare ratio minimum. And that was, it sounds reasonably achievable today, but at that stage it was quite scary for both developers and even the client, Hobsonville Land Company at the time. So we had to do a lot of testing. We looked at old suburbs around Auckland, we looked at the grain. And one of the things about the housing, the way the housing is arranged, was that we needed to, I guess, test the development controls. Under the current district plan at the time, we wouldn't have been able to achieve what's been achieved in terms of proximity and just the grain of housing that actually we also loved of the earlier neighbourhoods. So we actually challenged a lot of that. So we kind of led the planning instruments by design, if you like, and there was a lot of scenario testing. And I have to say a lot of that actually was the precursor to and actually influenced the NZI submission at the time on the proposed unitary plan. So some of those rules and setbacks and outlook spaces that replaced height and ratio boundaries or was a complement to that was as a result of a lot of the testing we were doing at Hobsonville at the time. So I like to think that Hobsonville is actually Hobsonville, but it's actually had an effect on Tamaki as a whole as well.
The sketch at the top is Freeman's Bay, which we studied a lot to look at the parts that make up a neighbourhood that's familiar and yet also dense, and the bottom one is Buckley Ave in Hobsonville. Is it one of the first streets to be built?
So we want to sort of set the scene a little bit with a provocation. You know, what role do we as designers play in creating demand? As I said earlier, not just meeting demand. How do we shift those markets, reset those mindsets, and actually go under the bonnet a little bit and find out where these demands are that have actually. There are a lot of unmet demands that we actually don't even realise are out there. What is at stake if we only do what the market says? And how do we inspire a new intergenerational narrative to emerge through the power of storytelling? And we'll come back to the storytelling because we think that's key.
So I think we increasingly find ourselves in an interesting position as designers when we look around at our rapidly changing world. Some things seem to be accelerating at pace. AI, technology, frequency of climate events, all sorts of stuff. And it's sort of anxiety inducing. But yet other things seem to be moving really, really slow, like the willingness for people to change our travel behaviours or to adopt new types of housing or, you know, to accept things that are happening around us. So there's kind of this interesting sort of pattern of change happening, and we find ourselves in between space as designers, leading and trying not to leave anyone behind. We move between the arts and the sciences, the stories and the facts, between nature and the built environments that we've created. And we live in a time where we may see the collapse of the scales and the systems of modernity, a way of knowing the world through science. And our over-reliance on that science as a source of overriding authority leads us to solutions that can only make things worse, like building defences to keep nature out. We're still finding our bearings and knowing what tasks are worth giving our lives to, how we name what is at stake, and determine what we are prepared to do about it. And interestingly, we find ourselves in this profession at a really important time in history. It's a storytelling profession that we're in. We use persuasion to create demand for products we can and should desire. And in the in-between space, we can flip the narrative to optimism, to incite that change and create that demand for a better way of living. It's the space where we move from knowledge to knowing, and it comes from experiencing that change. And as we leave this period of modernity behind, are we entering the age of nature? And as the demand for green energy, urban development and climate infrastructure grows, This is an exhibition in Copenhagen that's happening at the moment at the Danish Architecture Centre, asking if architecture can help us create a future where both nature and humans can thrive. And I think this is a conversation that's happening everywhere. And in Aotearoa, we're looking at that through people are part of nature, through a te ao Māori worldview. There's a story that returns to kind of Indigenous wisdom to help take us into a new era. And in asking that, should cities be densified to preserve the landscapes and to let nature back in, to ensure that biodiversity and balance come back and go beyond the technical solutions and refine our story, one where we see nature as a collaborator. In this book, which I thoroughly recommend, if you haven't read it, you have to read it several times, At Work in the Ruins by Dougal Hine, poses that we need to move beyond climate science and activism to a quieter path of Indigenous wisdom, tapping into the self-determination and resourcefulness of communities who have the capability to live with nature and make room for it. And so creating demand can be linked to the ideas of adapting and adopting a different way and a better way of living over near and far time scales, different spatial scales, and it really depends on the market and the audience. So there's lots of sort of dynamics to, I guess, this topic. In typical fashion, when we come up with a theme and then we write, put the presentation together afterwards, there's all sorts of things that we've discovered along the way about ourselves and the way we do things too. There's three things we just wanted to talk to before we kind of deeper dive into some projects. One is around the growing pains and the disruptors that we're seeing, the patterns of internal migration within the country, the outward migration from small towns, migration between cities, things that are prompted by economic shocks and by environmental events, COVID, remote working, we know all of these things, but in all of that, our small towns are dying, they're struggling, retail is changing, there are so many dynamics that are changing the environment that we're working in. We often find that in the regions, the words ageing and declining population are thrown in front of us and then a challenge to figure out how to regenerate those places. And whether it's a rapid influx in population in places like Tamaki, or whether there's growing pains in the other sort of towns and cities around the country, we need to sort of reflect on what that's doing and how we're responding and adapting ourselves within our design process. And now more than ever, it's a time for intervention where we can actually bend growth curves, not accept what those reports tell us, and create demand for a new way of living. What's at stake is whether it's rapid growth or slow decline, the risks are similar. Ultimately, it's a risk that we break those DNA bonds that exist in communities, the glue that holds those places and those people together and contributes to their kind of well-being and quality of life. And those bonds rely on safety and equity and familiarity and inclusiveness and a whole lot of things. And the idea of creating demand is a key to the diversity of options that will help us live, work and age in place. And then there's the mood for change. So how do we work in an environment where we can actually be the instigators of that change and that demand? And how do we create a mood that actually ultimately is reliant on our own people skills and our ability to tell stories and use the powers of persuasion? And I think using the analogy of storytelling, you kind of need to read the room first, understand your audience, create the environment to tell that story, and then choose your story well. And even better, invite your audience into the experience of authoring that story with you. Sometimes it's a little hard to see, but the idea of going through almost a grief process, if it's something like an event that's happened, that people could, their resistance to change could be strongly rooted in fear or shock or denial of what's happened, and it can take a while to work through that process before you kind of get to the point of talking about the things that optimistically could change. And the early adopters and pioneers in the sort of the marketing version of early adopters and pioneers, and the big chasm that happens in between those people who readily jump onto ideas and innovations and those that need a bit more time, deep time and close time to connect with those ideas. So there's sort of those three threads, I guess, will be sort of carried through some of our project examples. As will the idea that regeneration is a process. It's not a thing that happens at the end of sort of doing a bit of design. It's sort of design as a process. And in that process of regenerating, it's kind of creating those layers of adaptation and change. So a lot of what we do is sort of hands-on participatory design work with communities. It's not always a case of sitting at our desk and just coming up with something. We have a very close connection to the people that we work with. And I think a major factor is really the pace of change that's happening, the scale of change, and the certainty of change, as we'll illustrate in a moment. And so that brings us to Westport. I want to tell you a story about Westport and what's going on there at the moment, because I think it has some significant learnings for us as an island nation with a lot of coastline, and how we need to think about adaptation going forward. It's a different angle on creating demand, and you might wonder how that kind of ties into a story like this, but it's the kind of demand that's needed to drive intergenerational change and a new narrative about how we live with nature in a country like ours. Ki uta ki tai, from source to sea, the mighty Buller River is the protagonist shaping the story of Westport. It's known to Māori as the Kawatiri Awa, which means swift and deep. And since the beginning, Westport has flooded, and it will continue to flood with increasing severity. The book Struggle for Survival paints the picture of one of the first pubs floating down the swollen river with its lights still on. And it raises the question, can people live in harmony with a river as mighty as the Buller, and why have people persisted for more than 150 years? The answer is partly in the lure of gold and coal. Westport's a hook shape on the coastline when viewed from above, and it's held in place by granite cliffs. The port serves an extractive economy, gold, coal, cement, mineral sands now, and it's Westport's connection to the world. A rail line was built specifically to move granite from the Cape to the tip head at the mouth of the Buller River, and over time the coastline has shifted and compounded flooding issues. So through human intervention to kind of create that opportunity, it has compounded that issue. In 21 and 22, Westport experienced a massive deluge and the town flooded again, leaving people homeless, anxious, angry. But then we look back to 1926 and there are boats in the street. So people ask, surely this time something will change. But now the town faces one of the most alarming hazard stacks in the whole country. The AF8, the Alpine Fault, liquefaction, sea level rise. It's a horrible stack of hazards to look at. But Westport's ongoing struggle for survival has been studied and documented for years since it was first settled. And competing forces have held the town in a perpetual state of vulnerability. Job instability, high social deprivation, population flux. It's grappled with all of these things, this magnitude of problems, and a really low ratepayer base. It's effectively an island when it's in flood, cut off by not only the Buller River but overflow into the Otawaiti, which floods the town from behind. It's the largest river on the coast, and the flood carries a greater torrent than any other river in New Zealand. Its large catchment effectively exits through a pinhole right on the coast where Westport is located. So lots of impressive hazard mapping has been done. I'm not going to show you that. And lots of predictions about what the future will hold. They are predictions. But this is not a story of despair that I'm about to tell you. It's one of hope and choice. And it's easy to see on this elevation map the comparison between the low-lying blue stuff and the green high points, and it's an easier way to understand the problem and potential in one picture. We don't actually need to hit people over the head with all of the science. Resilient Westport's program of work under the PARA framework, you might have heard of it, means protect, avoid, retreat and accommodate. It's a multi-tool approach. You can have all of those things going on at the same time. The work that we've been doing fits under the retreat portion of that PARA framework. And while managed retreat has been an academic conversation for quite some time, there is actually no such thing as managed retreat in this country. We don't do it. There is no mechanism for equity transfer or insurance loss or anything like that. So while we talk about these things, this is a story of what we've encountered in real life. So if not now, then when? If not us, then who? Was a statement that was made by the Mayor of Bulla, and it really set this whole thing in action around the idea of hope and choice, and how we would traverse a range of timescales and spatial scales happening all at the same time, and how we would have a conversation with the community about that, given that all we had was a bunch of hazard maps. This is where we started, with a vision connected to place, past, present and future. It's not a vision framework that's 200 pages long, it's 3 huge posters, 3 metres long, and a deep discovery of what is the Westport Way, what is the story of this place, the rise and fall of settlements over time, the changing dynamic of the landscape, the layers of the landscape from hydrology to geology, and all of the things that actually make up a dynamic landscape that has been constantly changing all of this time and gives us cues about adaptation. And living in this landscape, what's in abundance here is a conversation: why have settlements appeared and then they've disappeared? And more than ever in this place, there's a pattern over time where places have come and gone, they've grown, they've moved, they've changed. And it's not something, until you kind of go back through that story and you look at why those settlements are there, what they've responded to, and why their shape has changed, that you realise that not only is the landscape dynamic, but the settlements themselves are dynamic. And it gives a clue to there is something in the DNA that still exists that allows Westport to adapt as well. We started a participatory design process, and we used these settlement pattern cards to start to have a conversation about the capacity for those settlements in that landscape. The coast is often described here as untamed wilderness, and yet with the desire to remain in Westport remains an attempt to tame that environment and protect ourselves from it. So the notion of resettlement introduces a way of living, a lifestyle that's familiar in a landscape that is vast and unyielding. And so it is a process of designing settlements that fit with that landscape and take that essence of place and translating that into a suite of tools that we can use to design a future. The compass was developed also with the community, and the language that we discovered along the way is embedded in that compass. There were words that were real barriers to conversation, and there were other words that were words that opened up a conversation, and also starting to take an intergenerational view. This is 20, 50, 100 years into the future. What does this place look like, and what decisions have been made now by being good ancestors? It bakes in well-being, sprinkles of donut economics, and it is a navigational tool for the future. It explores how people will live in this landscape, be part of nature, and also be hazard ready and out of harm's way. This deep exploration extended across 5 full design weeks over an 8-month period, with a rhythm and line of sight from vision to concept framework and beyond. It was a really immersive journey of collaboration, testing, reflecting, adjusting our course, and we did not predetermine an outcome. We went into this community with questions about their place and prompts, and we went from there. We didn't talk about hazards. We didn't start with the idea of managed retreat or climate change or anything like that. It was a conversation about their place. And you might assume that the people who were involved in a process like this were cherry-picked as early adopters or the newly converted or the climate change activists, but the people in the room were a mix of young and old. There were some conspiracy theorists in there, there were climate activists in there were community leaders, there were even people who'd been red stickered through the floods and had lost a lot over that period of time. So it wasn't a cherry-picked group, it was a real representation of people going through something really significant. And from that foundation of a place-based language, we were able to develop a path of self-determination, which resulted in a piece of work around cutting our own track. A really important part of the sort of the creating demand linking to the theme was this whole mindset shift. So rather than focusing on, our initial brief was just to find a place, a location for a new town. It didn't even involve engagement with the community, but very quickly, in working with it in a trusted relationship with the client, we were able to kind of get to a point where the brief changed, and we were able to navigate that with the community, with trust in the tools. And that was really, really important. I don't think it would have ended up where it has had we not done that. And it would have been easy to sit in a corner and draw a place that we thought was appropriate for a new future town and job done. Adaptation is a little bit different to that. And a key to that shift in mindset and empowering champions for change for Westport was this idea of nested scales. So not only looking at Westport itself, but the wider Cape, an elevated marine terrace sitting above the river, offering opportunity for not only growth, but for Westport residents to relocate over time and to have that hope and choice to do so. But also along the entire coastline, 20% of homes are at risk of being flooded and of sea level rise. And so this is not only a solution for Westport, it's a solution for the coast. So they too will need to relocate in time. And bending the growth curve offers multiple benefits for a community that has no foreseeable way to fund their relocation efforts. By going wider in scale and using case studies to do so, looking at where growth has happened elsewhere in the country, what's triggered that growth, what were the disruptors and the patterns and the complexities of that, kind of built confidence that there was a way forward, that there was a how, and a way to uplift kind of the land value to fund the future infrastructure. Alongside this process, we also were working on a brand identity project for Bulla, which sort of grew as a brief out of the master planning process. And we discovered through that as well, the two projects informed each other that if you define with absolute clarity the values a community holds dear, you'll attract visitors that share the same values, and attracting those visitors will emulate these values, which will in turn will align to the right market at the right time. And attracting those visitors will ultimately result in the residents that we want. And it's the language that demonstrates an attitude and a mindset within the community that's capable of shaping the district's fortunes into the future, of attracting that growth and accepting that growth is important for relocation. And obviously we went through the process of developing criteria, of finding the best place for a town centre on the lakes. And we ended up with a rubber band plan, as we call it, where ultimately all of that kind of discovery around the settlements that exist and their relationship to each other, the buffers between them, the capacity they have to sit in that landscape, with the two anchors of Westport, and a future new town that is growing alongside it. and that they have a relationship to each other. It's essentially an algorithm where those things can't sort of pull apart too far and they can't get too close together, which would be sort of effectively something entirely different. It would be kind of sprawl. These are uniquely reflective of this place. So the town won't move tomorrow. There's effectively no way to scoop it up and move it, but there is a way to grow a new place, a place to attract new residents, to have an uplift in value and to enable that relocation to happen. I'm going to skip over this one, but dynamic adaptive pathways are a thing. They are complex and confusing. But they are important because that change might happen fast if another event happens and forced relocation happens, or it might happen really slow and intergenerationally. On the other side of the river, with that elevated marine terrace, it's held in place by solid granite cliffs. It offers a different perspective to the low-lying river plain at the mouth of Aotearoa, on which Westport is sited. And the land over here has been modified over time. It has been changed, but also the emerging ecology is starting to come back around those lakes and is flourishing. And the site of the proposed new town is close to both Westport, the state highway. It has views to the lakes and the coastline and all of the things that are familiar and important to people with the immediacy of that landscape. The campfire to home fire strategy is something that gathered huge momentum through the participatory design process. People were eager to see how temporary interventions could help Westport thrive over the next several decades, so we would not abandon Westport. As a service town, it needs to continue to function as such, but how we could have a new town in coexistence with Westport, able to grow and have the right kinds of activities and functions. So the campfire to home fire strategy was about starting to do some things, tying a knot in the Kaupapa Trail to encircle the lake, establish a forest school and a lake destination, and over time develop the main street on the way to that lake. So that shift in mindset ultimately was about placing Westport first. It was about creating the environment to have a conversation and therefore believe the potential, and then wanting to grow. Initially, people didn't want to grow, they wanted to protect their place from growth until there was an understanding about the kind of growth that was good growth. The new town having an important mix of activities that might have something on offer that isn't currently on the coast, and Westport itself in tandem evolving its land use over time and its new purpose emerging through that process. We had youth involved in the process quite strongly, and at the end their voice shone the loudest in talking about the future being for them. They were passionate about it, and some of the questions that we asked them about what the carrot and the stick, or the proof and belief that was needed to undertake something so momentous, in their view, was important. But these are the future leaders of this place. So the master planning story was picked up by John Campbell, if you know John Campbell, who rang the mayor with an idea for a doco, but he quickly left with a different concept, which was tracking this project, this process, the first time ever a conversation had started to happen like this, really, that he knew of, or that anyone knew of, really, that is connected to a case study for the National Adaptation Plan, and is sort of starting to shift the dial about how we think about adaptation in this country. So it's kind of a significant piece of work, and his documentary, I recommend it. You can find it online. It's about an hour long. While it features Westport's journey, he's also expanded that to a wider angle lens that talks about the plight of small town New Zealand, the impacts of climate change on local economy, and how optimism plays a really key role in creating demand for growth and revitalisation, and why that's important to all of us, no matter where we live, that those towns survive and thrive. The significance of this is not to be underestimated, I think. Until now, like I said, much of the dialogue has been academic. This is a community now creating the momentum for self-determination and looking to kind of continue along this path. And while it's a rare example of this, it's gathered attention on a national level. And the journey really has just been about from values to a potential and flipping a prevailing mood of fear and anger and division in the community to one filled with energy, hope and optimism. And that's happened through a process of design tools and having a conversation. So I might probably be needing to skip on with time, I imagine. So I'll finish this piece just by saying in the work that we do, in the world in which we operate, in that in-between space, we could fail to communicate or over-communicate or get the words wrong. The language is everything in the story that we develop with our communities. It's perhaps the biggest risk that we carry if we come in with predetermined outcomes and we use our own words and force people to accept that. Essentially, a place-led spatial response is nuanced by community voices, and the key is using the language of place. And we found that exploring hope and potential has an even greater pulling power when something loved is connected with something that's desired. It's scalable, can provide the context and license for accelerating change when needed, and ultimately the regenerative strategies, they can help heal and repair the mauri and mana of land and water, and also the people.
So I thought we'd just move up and down the scales a bit. So we've been hearing a bit about things at quite a big scale, and I wanted to focus a little bit on something that's dear to us all, housing. It affects us all, and there's a lot of opinion in the country about it. And so there should be. It's a vexed topic, and particularly housing affordability. I'm not going to dwell on the statistics. I think we'll all be familiar with them. But what is probably interesting is that at the current point in time, there is about 63% home ownership across the population. It peaked back in 1991 at 75%. So the current 63% is quite a drop. And it's actually the lowest since 1991, before the government started the state-sponsored house building program. What is interesting is that if you look at the top right graph, as recent as 2015, the yellow bars are saying what we're wanting, where the demand was, which was for smaller homes, 1, 2 and 3 bedroom homes, and yet only 10 years ago what we were delivering was the pink. So we hear a lot in the media about supply and demand, and if we meet the supply, then house prices will correct themselves. We know there's a lot more layers to that, and it's more complex. So I just wanted to interrogate that a little bit more. We are catching on. Since 2015, we have shifted the dial in terms of what we're building. We're now starting to build smaller homes. We're building more attached homes. The graph on the right top, and I should just clarify if you can't see it, the baseline is at 40%. It's not saying that standalone houses have dropped to zero, but we are at about a 50-50 relationship. In fact, I think it's just gone over with attached housing and smaller homes level pegging with what we're building in terms of standalone homes. I think the other thing that's interesting is that homes have got smaller, but much more quickly sections on which the homes sit have got smaller proportionately, and the demand is still for smaller homes, and you can see that trend on the bottom right, which is what's happening. But I think it's more layered than that, and I think it's more nuanced than that. And there is a thing we often talk about in the studio, which is when we're trying to problem solve, is what's the need behind the need? It might seem like an obvious question, but often, as many of you will know, having conversations with clients, they'll say one thing, but by the time you've asked a whole lot more questions, there's actually a different narrative that's starting to reveal itself. And I want to tell you a quick story about this book, Competing Against Luck, which has got nothing to do with architecture or design, but it is about trying to identify the things that actually really need doing. And there's a chapter that starts with, and this is in the US, with a property developer who is he's wanting to put up some apartment complexes. He's trying to cater for the 55 and over. And he's going through the usual motions of sales suites, marketing material, well price pointed, and going through the motions that they would normally do and actually achieve some good sales. A lot of options in terms of finishes, and a lot of foot traffic through the sales suites for the product that he was trying to promote. But there were very few conversions to the sales, and they couldn't quite understand what the problem was. So they got the architect to make some changes. They added some bay windows, they added a few more bells and whistles, offered a few more options, up-spec'd the appliance packages that would come with it, and they thought that might fix things, and again, nothing really changed. Then they got a hold of a guy called Bob Mooster. You can Google him. He's a sort of entrepreneur type, but sort of tries to bring different perspectives to how you do that. And it wasn't until he interrogated and had some focus group sessions, started some conversations with some of the people coming into those sales suites, and he also started to map a timeline of their lives. What got them to this point in their lives, and why were they looking to downsize? Why were they, at 55? What was happening in their lives? And it revealed an interesting clue, which was the dining room table. And Bob Mooster, he kept hearing about the dining room table. If only they could get rid of the dining room table, then they would be able to move, and they'd be able to, pick up an apartment or move into the apartment. And Bob was going, what's the deal with the dining room table? And it was only a few weeks later that he sat down at a Christmas dinner for his own family that he made the connection of the dining room table linking to memories, and the idea that it represented a life built together. You'd built forts under it with the kids, and you'd had Christmases, dinners, parties, you did homework there together, and it revealed this whole issue of people being really anxious and having anxiety around letting go of things that are dear to them when you're downsizing. When you're in the market of downsizing and you're targeting the 55 and over, that's the stage of life that they're in. So they made some changes. One is they made the dining room area slightly bigger, and they made the second bedroom slightly smaller. So the overall GFA was still the same. They offered moving services. They offered 2 years of free storage in addition to the home they were in, and they offered a kind of a sorting area in terms of downsizing. You heard a lot about even just clearing out the closet would take days with boxes of tissues, because that's what was going on in their lives. And then he discovered that all the options they were given, instead of actually adding more, they found that overwhelming, because they were already making so many decisions about downsizing. They didn't want to make decisions about finishes and furnishings to the units they were going to. So they offered a really basic 3 completed fitted-out units as options, which didn't overwhelm the prospective buyers. That changed sales dramatically, and because they actually understood the problem and they worked out what the real need was behind the need. And I want to just take that to a local example. Many of you will know of Rewi Thompson. I was privileged enough to work with Rewi for only 18 short months when he was working at Isthmus with us in 2016 before his passing. And I always think of Rewi when we were talking about the need behind the need. He was very involved with what we called the Everyday Home for Northcote. That was a home that was less about a traditional brief It was a very, when we talked about what the homes needed and how they needed to respond in terms of design, it was all about emotional qualities, feelings, and his poem captured that really well. And the poem was kind of we were going back to a lot of that every time we were thinking about what the houses needed to do. And just very quickly, the way that translated in some of the design moves was that the home needed to be flexible and the living spaces needed to be open, rather than a more central island kitchen that perhaps sat central within the kitchen and dining living spaces to the outside of that. It was actually tucked away to a corner, and it allowed the open spaces to be more flexible. And he thought of the site right the way through from front boundary to rear boundary as living spaces that could be adapted. And it could be more private or it could be more public as the need suited. The houses were quite standard. They needed to be affordable, but equally they needed to be individual and have a character of their own. So whilst there was a repetitive model using just 2, 3 and 4 bedrooms, the upper part and the roof forms could be adapted to any and interchanged, and the cladding systems could be changed. The other thing that Rewe was very keen on was that everyone should have access and outlook to the outside, no matter which room in the house you were in. So even the circulation spaces, the stairs, you'll see windows at the ends, and that reference to the outside was really important. From the everyday home, we went to everyday Northcote. Helen.
Everyday Northcote, obviously riffing off the idea of everyday homes, was a publication, a magazine. We seeded the idea in 2017 with Kaingaora and Eki Panuku as part of the redevelopment of an existing suburban area where people and their everyday lives mattered. And those small meaningful interactions were sort of recorded in these stories and these conversations with people and the types of things that they wanted to talk about and their hopes for the future. And we found that working fast in communities like this, it's easy to overrule or overlook the needs and make the changes that are deemed necessary for the good of all, but miss the things in the everyday that are so important. So to Andre's example of everyday homes in Northcote, to put that in context, from the first discussions that we had when everyday homes were a thing, we were kind of like, well, maybe this is sort of a nudge in density. We're going to sort of start to change the conversation slowly. This is an existing suburban area with character, and it's going to undergo some significant change, so let's take it slow. But that change straight away, it soon became clear that that nudge was a massive step change. Not incremental change, it was going to be a step change in density and scale. It was going to happen fast to meet housing demand, and with that shift would come opportunity for affordable housing and healthy homes. So that change did take place on a big scale, on a quick time frame that hadn't been seen before. As you can see in the photo here, this is sort of partway through the build, still changing. You may have been out there and experienced it, but and therefore it became the first cab off the rank as part of the Auckland Housing Programme, testing how we work in suburban areas to change that dialogue and to meet that need. At that super lot scale, it was sort of a mixed integration, a kind of a third, affordable homes to market and social housing, and that integration was quite sort of equitable across the development area. But really the bit that I wanted to talk about is the green thread that links it all together, and what and how important that was in the process of being able to get the social licence to accelerate that program of work and still feel that the community had something at the end of it that was of importance. So the shared space became the focus and the opportunity. And that came from understanding the story of the whenua. I'm going to move quickly through this, but the stream that once flowed through this area was underground. It was in a pipe, it couldn't be seen. and for that story to emerge and come to the surface became really important to help that step change and stitch the fabric of that community back together. The memory of the stream had been carried through the generations, and it reappeared, it re-emerged as an outdoor classroom and a connector between neighbourhoods, a playful pathway, a daylighted stream, and it had come to life with the community and with the schools alongside it. Children were at the centre of that conversation, with schools as sort of gateway into the community and a way of sort of an indicator, I guess, for the well-being of that place over time. It became effectively the shared backyard for Northcote. And with that te taio, the nature being brought back into what was effectively becoming an increasingly urbanised space, and in the floods that happened in 2019, I've written this somewhere but I've lost my notes, you could really see the performance of that space holding those flood waters and then receding, and what it meant, I guess, to live at density and with nature at the same time. And that was it returning back to normal not long after those floods, becoming, again, an open space the community could use. And with the threads of community bound together and that story of place being woven together, it's retained the memory of that place, of the stream that was underground, and has connected something familiar back into a community that has really changed substantially. Some surveys had been done. The interesting thing that came out of them really midway through that build was indicators of social cohesion, ways of knowing your neighbour, meeting people in the street, all of those interactions increasing, and that at the time Northcote was well regarded by the residents who lived there, but there was also a lot of disruption happening, and that was also represented in the results as well. But a third of the residents had neighbours they could connect with on a regular basis, and 90% had neighbours that they could say hello to and have a conversation with. And from that work, we, in Northcote, we started to make a bunch of design assumptions that were really driving the way we were responding to that need and how we were measuring wellbeing as a result of it. It kind of spurred us on into partnering with AUT and Kaupapa to undertake a 5-year program, research program, Te Hotonga Hapura. You can look it up online, but it's 5 interconnected projects that work together to investigate wellbeing and urban regeneration in motion. And on to Timaru. In the South Island. 3 years ago, on the main street of Timaru, we started a conversation about te hokinga ki te nākau, return to the heart. And the branding actually was something that we did as part of the project because it was about holding a conversation that had many, many parts to it. Effectively, it was one grand experiment over a 3-year program of work where we've been asked to sort of implement trials, real life experiences in an urban environment about bringing the vibrancy back to the town, and then kind of building that in reverse into a master plan. So it was quite an unusual, unique process of trialing something in the street, trying to fill vacant spaces and shops and look at different travel modes and behaviours, and then to be able to take those learnings through data and evaluation and surveys and information that we were capturing to inform a master plan that would signal how the community was ready to start to make shifts and changes in order to kind of bring that vibrancy back to the town centre. And there's no doubt that it's struggling and in decline like many other town centres across the country. And yet it has massively untapped potential. It's right on the coast, it's got a port, it has a massive park, Caroline Bay, all things which should ultimately attract people to a place. So there was something not quite right, and it was about trying to kind of tap into that mood for change and understand the problem, which partly came from understanding the landscape, why it's a hook on a long straight coastline, and why Timaru means a place of shelter, and how that could kind of inform the narrative. The shoreline has changed substantially over time, obviously through the building of the port and the accretion of land that's led to a park that didn't actually even exist a while ago. So that environment and that connection that people had to the place when they first built and first settled there has changed. And so the way to reconnect back with that coastline and with the underlying landscape needs a different solution. And that led to 4 key moves. These key moves are not too dissimilar from other things that we find are really important building blocks in the regeneration of town centres, and they typically come back to reconnecting with the environment, bringing greenways back in, ways for people to travel that are kind of safe, reconnecting, in this case, with the coastline or whatever the natural asset is that was the reason for the place being there. When it originally settled, the idea of bringing urban living into the town centre, consolidating the retail, bringing it back to a kind of a core, a cultural core, a heart, and the urban living piece being something really, I guess, that has been talked about a lot in other places, but one of those things, again, that is actually about creating the demand and making that happen and showing and demonstrating the real life examples of that. Skip over that one. Some of the trials that we did that were reconnecting people with the shoreline included a bi-directional cycleway along the Port Loop Road that took people from the centre to the coastline, and we realised that making these connections and showing how important it was for people to have that accessibility to that environment would actually be a major initiator for urban living and for urban pioneers who might be attracted to that opportunity, whereas at the moment it's all sort of cut off. So we tried a bunch of things, some worked, some didn't, but that's the whole point of trials, is that you don't expect there to be a perfect outcome, you expect there to be something that you can learn from about things that the community might readily adopt and things they might take a while to adapt to. Those trials were really wide-ranging, and a lot of them were really quite playful and encouraging people to explore the city in ways that they hadn't before. Even to a game, if you've done an indoor escape room before, it was kind of the outside version of that across the whole city, in a way of kind of doing it in a playful way. And we captured a lot of data from that process in lots of different ways, quantitative and qualitative, experiential through GIS, tracking, all sorts of things, a huge volume of stuff, which we created a website for, and there is still information on about these trials and about the master plan and the strategy that evolved from it. And so the streetscape is by far the biggest challenge in town centres. Everybody wants to talk about parking and how they can park their car there when they come in from wider rural areas. And so that's a major in terms of the mood for change and a way to change an environment that needs to work for urban living. And so the carrot and stick discussion started to happen. Do we start with changing the streets and removing the parking and create that environment that then the private investors want to come in and do, or do we go the other way around and do we start with urban living, get the people there and then create the environment that supports that? So that chicken and egg, carrot and stick, all of those analogies used in this case. The kit of parts was something that we used to nudge that change, capture information and experiment with the way people use those spaces. But then coming to the urban living, like I said, Ngā Motu, New Plymouth, other places where we have identified that urban living is really important to reinventing the way we use our town centres. It's entirely changing. We're not going there just for retail purposes. We're going there for social reasons now, places to connect, hang out, and also to live and work. And the interesting thing that we found in this was that when we started the project, the Venture Timaru, the Economic Development Agency, were campaigning with council around opening up more area for greenfields around the edges, that there were workers, there was a strong employment vibe in Timaru, and they needed places for workers, they needed to provide more housing, and that they were going to do that by expanding the edges of the town. And I'm pleased to say that those articles where Nigel Davenport appears talking about that have entirely flipped now to promoting urban living and building that into their strategic plan and working with local architects and builders and effectively starting to put into motion some of the work that we started around urban living.
So Helen's mentioned the urban living quite a bit, and I think part of that change and mind shift was a targeted bit of work, which we called the Inner Living Study for Timaru. We started with focus groups, local workshops, focus groups, and just anecdotal conversations with through the trials and people stopping by and having a conversation. What do we call this? The hub. We had a temporary space in the main street that we actually operated from. And out of those focus groups, we just wanted to test where people were on the density scale or the density gradient. The upper half of that bottom image is really about images from abroad, and you can see the density gradient from left to right. Below the dotted line is really what's happening in Timaru. And again, you'll see there lots of gaps, lots of question marks. So a lot of really unmet demand that we were trying to uncover, and who would be up for some inner city living, and what would they need to be? What were some of the barriers preventing them from coming into the city? I won't go into too much detail on this, but we actually identified 5. You'll see 4. I think we've missed one of them, but there were 5 user groups effectively that we did a bit of work around, and asked some pertinent questions, did the survey around, and effectively identified that there were 2 out of the 5 user groups that were really potentially up for inner city living. There were younger families, older families, young couples, older families, young families, and empty nesters and retirees. Suffice to say, what came out of the survey and the feedback was the dial is the most filled on the empty nesters, so we're talking again about the 55 and overs, the downsizing. They were most ready and keen to move into the inner city. But there were some barriers, and that came out of the conversation, as I say, with the workshops. Key themes of the barriers really were issues around frontage relationships, and I mention that specifically because this is about infill, working in with a lot of heritage buildings. Those buildings meet the street edge quite hard. There's very little setback, so trying to introduce residential in amongst all of that with a really hard edge, how do we mediate and transition from patently public and active environment into a residential environment? So we did a little bit of work on that. You'll see proximity, separation and outlook is no surprise. Everyone's always concerned about some of those. We did a little bit of work on that. Diversity of housing. I can't remember the exact numbers, but there's only about 400 people living in Timaru City at the time. It might even be less than that. But there was really a lack of diversity. There were a couple of townhouses, and there was one apartment block being proposed for the area we were looking in. Vehicle access. A lot of the conversations went back to, I currently live in suburbia. I like the garden. I like the car parking. I like to have storage. I like to have my privacy, but I don't want to maintain the lawns. They're too big. So it was trying to sort of take the things that they identified in a suburban setting, and if we could recast them, kind of keep them, but recast them for an inner city living situation. So again, we did a number of schemes around car parking, how car parking could work, whether it was garaging car pads or group car parking, and outdoor space. The idea that there was quite a reaction to the idea of Juliet balconies or small balconies. That didn't cut it in terms of outdoor space. It needed to be something more substantial than that. If we had decks, they could even be at the upper levels. They needed to be practical, and you could sit out there and a barbecue and have a table and chairs and entertain. Or roof terraces where you could grow your veggies in pots and things, or even communal spaces if they were managed well. So this goes into a little bit more detail. So I've sort of touched on them already, and I should just say this was not a design guide per se. It was really just to give a bit more clarity to the council and potential property developers to sort of set out why the front relationships, what are we actually talking about it, and why actually is it important. And if you did it well, and if you did address it, you would be reducing or taking away some of the barriers for why people might come to the city. Similarly here, what was quite interesting is the open space. We often talk about indoor-outdoor flow, and yes, that is really important when you're entertaining, but people seem quite happy to actually have an upper level living condition. And we also know through some of the work we've done in Hobsonville and others, as those densities get tighter, that actually lifting yourself off the ground floor and actually being a level or two up, having outlook, feeling less enclosed, or having visual dominance from adjacent buildings was something people responded to quite well. But all of the open space, and when you interrogated what was happening in the open space, was at times people were really just growing some pot plants or their veggies, and that didn't need to link to indoor or outdoor flow. So you could actually start to split some of the outdoor spaces, or the activities you would have in outdoor spaces. You could actually start to split those up. Diversity I've sort of touched on, and that's just coming back to resilience and choice and lifestyle, affordability, nothing new there. I've already talked about the vehicle access, and again, just touching on these outdoor spaces. One thing we needed to do was not just talk about that and illustrate what might be good examples or changes, but we moved to sort of pilot, I guess what we call pilot projects, where we got a little bit more real, and we identified a number of sites in the city. There were 5 in the end, and there were some criteria that we set for those. They either needed to predominantly be some council-owned land. What was the arm called for the development side of council again? I forget, but it's effectively the equivalent of Eke Panuku for Auckland Council. And then we targeted land developers that actually owned larger parcels of land. So there was less aggregation of smaller parcels and less owners to deal with. And it's quite a networked, I guess, environment. It's quite small in the sense that everyone kind of knows who owns what. And the image you saw earlier with Nigel Davenport, Venture Timaru, he was quite knowledgeable about who owned what and who would be more up for a conversation. But I think the key thing was that, and I'll just show you 2 examples. I won't go into the detail of those, but that was the level at which we sort of interrogated those and demonstrated what could go on them, factoring in that we were trying to sort of address those barriers that people were concerned about. But just flicking back to the sites themselves, was that there was a sense from a lot of landowners, and these have often been sites that have been in families for a long time, intergenerational. They're not property developers, and they needed to be shown a way of how their property could be developed. And it could start, these sort of things were just a start. It often didn't owe them anything, and it was easier not to do something rather than to do something. They just needed to see a way of starting to do that. And interestingly, some of the confidence came out of the fact that, yeah, but I don't want to be the first land developer to do something. I want to know that others are doing it. And by actually doing 4 or 5 sites and people understanding that it could happen at the same time, that gave them some confidence. I'm going to skip over that. Quickly touch on 2 more projects, small houses and a project called Vinegar Lane, which you'll probably know a little bit about, but I just wanted to go and take a different lens on that. when we think of the Kiwi lifestyle, we're often talking about detached freehold titles and outdoor space. These are some of the things that keep repeating in a lot of the work we're doing. But what we were trying to do at Hobsonville was to find out how we could retain some of that, but increase the density. And that's where the Small Homes Test Lab came into being. Some of you might know about it. We worked with Architecture Workshop to develop 3 homes, 1, 2 and 3 bedrooms. They were co-located, called the Test Lab, well designed. We had them as show homes for several months. At the end of it, they surveyed people coming through all the way through. I think what's an interesting statistic is that of all the people surveyed over those several months, 70% effectively were saying they were comfortable or very comfortable in living in a small home. It went to auction at the end of that, and they sold within the hour, all of them. We then were trying to test the density a little bit further to say, well, how dense is our small homes actually? How do they sort of compare to the quarter-acre section, which is just a sort of a test piece we did on a site in Tamaki, in the Tamaki regeneration area that is, where you're getting 12 dwellings a hectare on the old traditional state houses in that area. If we're going to some traditional terraces with a lane, maybe 2 standalone homes, you're up to 40 dwellings a hectare. And the small homes actually were, when you take that same parcel and arrangement, we were getting to 60 dwellings a hectare. But that's not as much as walk-up apartments and, scaling from there. So this is where we wanted to sort of experiment with the small home, and the idea of the small home being kind of an extraction of a unit out of an apartment building on the ground. How do we scale that up and retain the freehold title component to it? And that seemed to be something that was really key, certainly to the Vinegar Lane project. Many of you will have heard about it and will have read about it, and there's a whole lot of things going on there in terms of city making, grain and character and incremental building out of city shaping that can be done by mom and pop developers, if you like, rather than a large developer doing an apartment building. But what a lot of people don't realise is actually the genesis or the starting conversation around that was actually, again, the freehold title. How do I own something freehold that isn't a standalone home in suburbia? If I want inner city living, how do I get to freehold title? And that's really what Vinegar Lane was trying to do. That then drove a consenting regime, or a process, I should say, which was a design manual, a framework, a design process, and evaluating all of that, and the idea that different architects were at play with individual sites for their owners. There were a few learnings out of Vinegar Lane that we've taken on board over the years. Because they are their own party wall, they're effectively houses squashed together. So it's not a common shared party wall. Each unit has its own side wall that is just located very close to the adjacent neighbour. And that produced some issues around logistics, crane image, how to share that, cranes operating over neighbours that had already completed homes, and safety issues. And of course, as the build out continues and there's fewer and fewer sites, there's fewer ability to actually deal with the logistics of the construction. The party wall construction themselves was interesting. Just the fact that was all done in concrete and therefore requiring a kind of a more complex build produced a number of challenges. I just want to finish off with what I call the other 86 and other 86%, and that is a bit of a challenge, I think, around retirement and living for elderly people. I don't know if many of you will know, but if you read the Retirement Commissioner's report at the moment, we are tracking at about 14% of everybody over 65 in the population that actually lives in a retirement village. That says that 86 of us don't, and there's a whole lot of numbers and stats as to why that is, some by choice, some not. But what is interesting is we're in an ageing demographic, and the prediction is that by 2070, 24 to 34% of the population will be represented as 65 and over. And what's more interesting is there's actually a prediction that the percentage going to retirement villages relative to that population base is potentially going to decrease, because less and less people will actually be able to afford retirement villages. So I think there's a bit of a challenge in that for us. There was a project that we did recently and we're still working on where, again, we did some personas as to who might be interested in those. And although it's not shifting the dial really that far from retirement villages, we have started that conversation with the client, and we're looking at things like the idea of hamlets and clusters of settlements for elderly that are entwined with a rural environment and an open space that is actually still part and sitting around an existing village, and that the amenity and the servicing is actually coming from an existing village. There was some work we did around the housing in the familiar, which I'll skip over, and there's an idea there of how that could work. So we'll leave you with a challenge. Thank you.